Fantastic. All right. My watch is reading 4 o'clock, so I'm going to get us started. Welcome, everyone, to our weekly webinar series here at Crow Canyon. I've got a few words to say before we turn it over to our awesome speaker for today, Dr. Matthew Pailes. So, got just a few things to say. If you don't know much about us here at Crow Canyon, if this is one of your first times coming to one of these webinars, we are a nonprofit research and education center here in Southwest Colorado near Mesa Verde National Park. Feel free to check us out at crowcanyon.org, or maybe even send us an email at info@crowcanyon.org. But there's lots about us. You'll learn a little bit here, and you could go to our website. It's pretty cool. For all of us who are old hands at Zoom, I still have to give us just a little bit of instructions. Make sure that your questions for Dr. Pailes, make sure that they are in the Q&A, which is circled here, not in the chat. I'm going to say it again, Q&A, not in the chat. And if for some reason something goes wrong, you can likely find this talk on YouTube in the next day or so. Okay. Want to go ahead and give a land acknowledgement here. So the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. With the work we are doing at Crow Canyon, we seek to bring light into the darkness of memory that these lands, waters, wildlife, and her descendants hold as a result of policies of removal, genocide, and displacement. We seek paths that support and align with Indigenous people and communities. With gratitude, we honor the contributions of present-day Indigenous communities, descendants, and colleagues with whom we partner who have helped guide our work and our mission. If you would like to donate to the webinar series, you could scan this QR code, and I will leave it here for a second. You can also, if you just go to crowcanyon.org, if you are interested in donating to any one of our programs, you can find all kinds of information on our website about how to do that. So I will leave it here for just another beat. One last announcement here, or second to last announcement. If you are interested in our cultural explorations programs, our new schedule for 2026 is coming soon, within the next week or two. If you keep track of our website or our social media, you should see announcements about that. So stay tuned for that. And we have a couple of a webinar next week on Montezuma Castle, so check that out next Thursday. And then the following week is our annual meeting, our Crow Canyon annual meeting. And if you go to our website, you can sign up for that as well and check that out. So that'll be pretty cool. Okay, let's introduce our speaker today, Matthew Pailes. So Matthew received his bachelor's in anthropology from the University of Oklahoma and his master's and PhD from the University of Arizona. Since 2016, he has been at the University of Oklahoma. He has worked in a variety of locations, including the Southwest, Southeast, and plains of the US, as well as overseas in Morocco. His principal research endeavors are in Northwest Mexico, where he is focused on the political economy of the 12th to 16th century. For the past 7 years, he has collaborated with colleagues John Carpenter and Guadalupe Sanchez on investigating the variable histories of different valleys throughout the Sierra Madre Occidental, through a project funded by both the National Science Foundation and the Consejo Nacional de Humanidades, Ciencias y Tecnologías. All right, so I will turn it over now to Dr. Matthew Pailes.
Thank you. Let me start sharing the screen here real fast. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see that there. So thank you so much for this invitation. Just right before we started, I mentioned it's been about 10 years since I did one of these presentations. And when I did that presentation, I was a freshly minted PhD. and still kind of somewhat casting about for ways to understand my own research and how it fit into a larger narrative. And specifically, I worked in the Valley of Moctezuma in Sonora. So today I'm going to try and be a good bit bolder. I've stayed interested in a lot of the same questions, but we're going to try and zoom out and think about some of these same themes at a very large scale. But before I jump into this, I should definitely acknowledge some of the people who've really inspired what I'm going to try and talk about here today. So on one hand, we have folks like Lewis Borg and Jeffrey Clark who have really started to change how we think about what's worthy of explanation in the North American Southwest in the question of political theater. So for many, many years, archaeologists tended to focus on those times and places where we thought we saw the most political complexity. And we always kind of argue about what the word complexity even means. But basically what we mean is institutionalized inequality. And so places like Chaco Canyon and the classic period Hohokam have got a lot of disproportionate attention. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there are certainly other very enduring traditions in this region that are also worthy of explanation. And so we're going to really try and kind of flip the script on what we kind of think of is meritorious of explanation in this presentation here. But I still want to draw from this larger intellectual history. And for that, I'm really going to kind of springboard off of some premises that Steve Lexon gave us for how we should think about talking about things at the grandest scales of things across the North American Southwest. And so for Steve, he said everybody knew everything. There were no coincidences, and geographical distances could be dealt with. And so the way Steve was applying these things, he was really talking about following elites around the Southwest and kind of creating this story of political dynasties and how they moved from places like Chaco Canyon to Aztec and then possibly down to Paquimé and influenced many other places along the way. And so what he's trying to get at here is when we see parallels in how things were organized across centuries and across hundreds of kilometers of space, that's not all that shocking. People had memories and people certainly traveled and they talked to each other. But I think we can apply those same set of premises to also kind of tell the counter narrative here. Now, something else I really want to build on from Steve is he points out that archaeologists have really struggled to overcome what we refer to as our unilinealist roots, right? Which is to say the way we first phrase these questions, arguably all the way back into the 1800s, has kind of stuck with us, right? And in those narratives, the general assumptions were that society should always only move from less complex, basically meaning more egalitarian, to less egalitarian with institutionalized leadership and these sorts of things. And this presented a real problem for archaeologists working in the North American Southwest because we had this ethnographic record where certainly we had very complex groups, but oftentimes they were quite egalitarian and they seemed to very intentionally design their societies to diffuse things like political power, right? And that's not the way it should really work out when you also have things like Chaco Canyon and classic period Hohokam platform mounds out there in the landscape that suggest these major ruptures in history, right? And so for Steve, he was pointing out basically, it's really not shocking that things can go in both directions. And so we're going to also kind of play on that idea, right? That we can understand that societies can make hard turns in how they organize things. But rather than treating these as some sort of accidental outcome or from some kind of exterior influence, we can make the bold assumption that maybe, at least sometimes, they did these things on purpose. So the other thing that we're really going to change in this presentation relative to a lot of these kind of grand narrative tellings of the North American Southwest is we're going to recenter things on what is today Northwest Mexico. And so if you open up any textbook on the Southwest, almost always you're going to find something that looks like one of these diagrams here, where they talk about shared traditions across this huge region that almost inevitably includes Northwest Mexico as half the region of what we refer to as the Southwest. So euphemistically, I'm going to kind of refer to this as the North American Southwest to get around that kind of awkward Northwest Southwest moniker. But the point I want to make here is that really these narratives only kind of treated Northwest Mexico as a bit of a periphery, a kind of also to be considered, but not really a central point in a lot of these narratives. Steve was actually a good counterpoint to that because he included Paquimé as such an important place in his reconstructions. But we're going to kind of counter all that and really focus on doing a transect across three regions. Obviously, only have about 40 to 45 minutes here, so I'm going to have to do this pretty rapidly. So I hope I don't do too much of a disservice to all my colleagues who have generated all the data I'm going to be using here today, but it's going to be obviously a bit of a cherry-picked narrative that I put together here. There's a lot more to be said about each one of these places. But in Steve's narrative, again, he was really focused on how these dynastic politics may be moved around, and I don't have any objection to that. I think it's a coherent story. There are a few things I would disagree with in there. But the basic idea that people kind of borrowed ideas from each other and they kind of repeated history over and over again by borrowing these ideas from place to place and time to time. And he defined this as the Chaco Meridian, which is this line that happens to run between some of the most impressively politically complex centers, Chaco Canyon, Aztec, Paquimé. There's some other places that are certainly influential along that line as well. So we're going to literally turn this 90 degrees. Oops, there we go. And I don't have a pithy name for this, the Northwest Mexico parallel or something of that nature. But we're going to cut a cross section across these three regions and see how recentering what we consider to be the heart of the Southwest tells us. So as I said, I'm going to have to go pretty fast through these regions. So just to kind of give away the main points I want to make about each one, so it's easier to follow along. For Casas Grandes, with its capital center of Paquimé, I'm going to be arguing that it was in fact quite hierarchical. So this lines up with exactly what Steve has said, but is quite contrary to what a lot of recent researchers have said, and particularly Mike Whalen and Paul Minnis have talked about the region. Not that they completely deny hierarchy was present, but they presented as much more of your typical North American Southwest society as opposed to something that was really heavily influenced from a place like Mesoamerica. But the part of the narrative I really want to focus on is that its downfall, that we can present this as an intentional kind of recentering and redirection of political theater when people very much intentionally moved away from this kind of perhaps foreign imposition of an ideological narrative that legitimized this very unequal society. Then we're going to jump across all the way to the other side of Sonora, to Trincheras. And here I'm going to very much hew to what's been crafted as, I don't want to call it the standard narrative, but the narrative that's been constructed by the most renowned researchers in the region, Alyssa Villapando, Randy McGuire. I don't really have any critiques of that, but I'm going to cast it in a somewhat bigger light of how I think it makes sense in relation to reactions against what was going on simultaneously in regions such as the Hohokam, which they were probably closely related to. And then finally, we're going to come back to the region where I've worked for most of my career, which is the Rio Sonora region, where I think you have a good record that suggests a profound distaste for any forms of institutionalized leadership, but interesting enough, presents one of the most stable records at a regional scale. So to jump right into things here, we begin with Casas Grandes, and I metaphorically reference Charles de Peso here in this image up to my right as the towering figure. And it was really Charles de Peso, along with his compatriot Eduardo Contreras Sanchez that first really started investigations in Casas Grandes. And this began in 1959, and it really took off with his publication in 1974 of this 8-volume set. Now, in many ways, de Peso was way ahead of his time in that he was very interested in telling an enlivened story, not just the kind of nuts and bolts and ceramic ratios, but a true narrative of what he thought happened at Casas Grandes. Unfortunately, there's no getting around the fact that he got a lot of the basic details wrong. Most obviously, his chronology was off by at least 100, if not 150 years. And just about everything he ever said has been critiqued, rightly so, to some extent. And one of the big elements of that is that he saw a lot of Mesoamerican influence here. But I don't want to make this a binary. Everybody recognized there was strong Mesoamerican influence on Paquimé. The question is, what was its nature and how direct was it? And for de Peso, it was very direct, and he actually thought the center was founded by Mesoamerican merchants. This is not an interpretation that has been upheld over time, but is often the case when we move away from one story in archaeology, we oftentimes swing a bit too far in terms of that pendulum. So a lot of what I'm going to say about Paquimé is really just reemphasizing those things that we've in fact known since the 1960s with Charles de Peso's observations, but have kind of fallen by the wayside since so much of our recent research has been focused on what Mike Whalen and Paul Minnis rightly refers to as the hinterland, which is to say they're focusing on how communities around Paquimé interacted with Paquimé in this broader Casas Grandes region. And their data is very clear that there is not actually a whole lot of the things that are really unique about Paquimé that flow out of the center to these places. But that, I think, has kind of swung the narrative a little bit too far away from recognizing just how impressive this one center was. So a few things I'll just mention here: a very elaborate architecture, massive stores of rare materials, possibly local copper forging. This is certainly controversial, but it's something that's been recently re-proposed by Jose Luis Punzo Diaz. Unique ceremonial features, human sacrifice. This is something that Charles de Peso recognized, but has become kind of reinforced with some restudies of some of the human remains from the site. And I won't be showing any pictures of those, but the evidence is pretty clear that this at least occasionally occurred. And then something that is quite new and noted in this bottom citation I have here by Sedig et al., a case for royal endogamy. And this is based on some genetic evidence from somebody that was a child sacrifice and deposited in a ritual context wrapped around the post, a literal foundation element of the site in its more or less center. And apparently, this individual had some very close relatives, probably something like grandparent, grandchild, um, aunt, nephew, something of that nature. And in a global context, the only place we see that sort of relationship being sanctified is if it's a case of a royal lineage, which, obviously is not complete proof, but certainly seems to suggest that you had some kind of entrenched inequality that was institutionalized at this place. So again, building on some of DePeso's basic observations, Mike Whalen has done a very good job of showing that he probably vastly overestimated the population. But even if we take Whalen's estimate and accept cutting this in half, that doesn't really detract away from just how singular Paquimé is on the landscape relative to anything else. So we see a massive investment of labor, a lot of it way over the top of what was necessary architecturally. So we have things like these so-called butterfly rooms, because they seem to have the shape of a butterfly. Something like 17 walls. That's obviously much more architecturally complex than what's needed in your standard four-room pueblo. Things like colonnades. Not easy to make a colonnade out of adobe. And these only show up in a couple of places in the North American Southwest, including at places like Chaco Canyon, but then, of course, also down in Mesoamerica. Some of these walls are incredibly thick, likely supported at least in a couple places in the site, not the site as a whole, but at least in a couple places, we probably have 3 stories, and I still hold out hope that there might actually be a couple places that were upwards of 4 stories tall. Not easy to build an adobe structure 4 stories tall, or even 3 stories for that matter. Lots of very unique architecture. This picture up on the right, the Mound of the Cross, almost certainly used for celestial alignments, but also a variety of effigy mounds, a feathered serpent, a deity known from Mesoamerican context, but also very important across the North American Southwest. Perhaps a bit more creatively, DePeso thought there was one mound that had the shape of a decapitated macaw. I'm not so sure about that, but obviously an eccentric shape, to say the least. And then eye-shaped ball courts, which are unequivocally Mesoamerican in character, as is the stone-faced architecture in general. And then, of course, massive amounts of rare goods. A lot of people have tried to downplay these to some extent. As I mentioned, Wayland and Minnis have unequivocally demonstrated this stuff didn't really flow out of Paquimé. That was very much DePeso's model, where he saw the center as a mercantilist location. But very clearly, Paquimé was the consumer as opposed to the distributor of these things. But we have, 4 million pieces of marine shell. Yes, it's true. 3 million of this are very small Nassarius beads. But you still had to pick up all those Nassarius beads and carry them across the Sierra Madre Occidental. So under any circumstances, probably not a minimal effort. And even if we threw those aside, you'd still have 1 million pieces left, which is more than any other center anywhere within several hundred kilometers of this location. Over 600 pieces of copper, and also just absolute eccentricities. My favorite being a 2,300 kilogram meteorite, which was hauled to Paquimé and had who knows what sort of symbolism, but clearly not an easy thing to transport to this location, as were mammoth bones and other kind of curious things that were brought to the site. So very clearly able to bring in many things, something I don't have depicted here, but it's also pretty conclusive that there was macaw aviculture, that they were raising macaws in this location. So a lot of discussions around Paquimé have very rightly centered on what was the nature of leadership. And this is where I'm really going to do a disservice to all my colleagues to not thoroughly present all of their models. But I think it's safe to say these break down into 2 camps, one that see it as relatively like other North American Southwest centers, things that were going on in Pueblo 3 and Pueblo 4 and other parts of New Mexico and Colorado are more or less replicated here. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you see people who think that this was a very exceptional place and that there was something kind of far beyond what you get at its contemporaneous population centers. And I tend to lean very much in that direction. Now, one thing Wayland and Minnis have very clearly demonstrated is that Paquimé, despite being in the best part of the floodplain, probably could not support itself with enough subsistence production. They couldn't generate enough food. But inversely, when we look in the surrounding area, we see some areas that certainly appear as though they're overproducing and probably making more food than they need. So the logic is that obviously this hinterland is provisioning this center. But since we don't really see anything flowing out of Paquimé, the only explanation that anybody really has, and there's a lot of nuance in these different models, is that they must have essentially exported ideology or exported religion, which is going to set up a very kind of precarious situation, obviously, that the whole system is basically based on good faith and belief. And if that ever comes into question, it's going to be very precarious, which is exactly what I think eventually happened. So setting aside many of the alternative explanations and just picking the one I like, to be honest, I'm going to play a bit with this idea that's been noted by Matthew Witz, who points out that a lot of the iconography in Pekine can be interpreted as a direct transportation of iconography that we see in codices of Mesoamerica. And Matthew Witz does an excellent job of kind of tracing how these evolve across the landscape and through time. And he doesn't end the story at Pekine. He takes it on up into the historic Pueblo air. And by and large, I think it's a very good model. Now, he's very concerned with just kind of demonstrating these connections, something that's not really investigated thus far, is how these ideas must have morphed as they move from a place like Mesoamerica up into the US Southwest, where you have very different sorts of political landscapes. And Pekime in this narrative is situated very much as a hinge point where it could go either way, right? And so we have in this Mesoamerican codices, what we have depicted here are people dressed up essentially as deities. And in the ontology of Mesoamerica, as we understand it, it's not just that they're kind of putting on a costume, but they're essentially embodying and becoming this deity, which unsurprisingly comes with a lot of political clout, and in a lot of cases, documented cases of the power of life and death over people. Now, by the time we recognize some of these same traditions in the Puebloan region, it certainly has been morphed quite a bit to meet local context, right? So the question is, what was Casas Grandis as it went through this kind of transitionary phase? So Chupili down in Mesoamerica, I'm not going to try and pronounce all these, but then through West Mexico, we don't know the term that would have been applied in Casas Grandis, and then actually quite a few different terms as it occurs in the historic Pueblos. And in my perspective, I think it was probably much more still of that Mesoamerican character, which would also kind of position it as a very kind of foreign ideology in this space at this time. Now, I should mention, I don't have time to go into it, but there's a completely alternative model presented by the Van Poels that interprets these depictions as shamans, but that's a story for another day. So like I said, what I really want to focus on here is what happened at the end of Pekime. And as is true with all things Pekime, there's a kind of a continuum of interpretations. So on one end of this, we can think of a model that is essentially slow urban decay. And there's no doubt that some degree of that went on, and De Peso recognized it himself. He saw good evidence of places where walls had collapsed and roofs had caved in, and people were still very much carrying on a Pekime existence, even in this somewhat declining state of affairs. But then there is also evidence for punctuated violence, and some people see this as being very significant. Other people see it as being not significant to maybe not even present at all. I tend to lean towards De Peso's original interpretation to think that it was a considerable moment of punctuated violence at the end of Pekime. There's been a lot of discussion in this about what De Peso referred to as type 2 burials, essentially burials that don't look like they were formally interred. And certainly some of these are not actually what De Peso thought. They're people who were just interred in kind of different ways and different systems. But there are also cases where I think he got it right. You know, there's rooms where we have a lot of bodies all piled in one room that certainly looked like it was very deep into the site and perhaps kind of like the last holdout of a location. There are bodies that are kind of left just completely out in the open with bones up against plaza walls and occasionally even strewn at least partially across doorways. And then what I think is probably the most convincing evidence, and this was something that was really pointed out to me by Steve LeBlanc, who deserves credit here. This very important ritual context, the location that Peso thought was actually the sanctum where the remains of the original founders of Pekime were stored. Perhaps that's a little bit elaborate, but there are certainly some very important people interred here in these large ollas, which is a very West Mexican style of interment, along with a lot of different ritual paraphernalia. And apparently, at the end of things, at some point, somebody came in here, they broke those ollas, they despoiled those ritual deposits. There were a couple of these things that were referred to as stone effigies that were pushed off their plinths, and then in one case, broken into three pieces, oops, and spread across the rooms. And then it certainly appears there are a couple of individuals that were in this context who were killed para-contemporaneously, as near as we can tell, with this despoilment, which certainly looks like, and you can tell the narrative of these were the kind of last guardians of this place, the last true believers who were then kind of dispatched that this place was despoiled. But even going beyond these burials, there's certainly a lot of other evidence. And the point I really want to drive home here, that people very intentionally appeared to move away from Pekime. A lot of ritual deposits were very intentionally strewn about or smashed or thrown from ceilings and crashed across plaza floors and then left there, presumably to be slowly covered by aeolian windblown sediments and melting adobe. These were things that people certainly could have come by and picked up. You know, almost certainly the larger landscape knew that there were many storerooms there that had many exotic things in there, but everybody seemed to come to the common consensus to not carry these things away, right? There seems to be this very intentional forgetting to a certain extent of what the political nature of Paquimé was. And what we see coming next, it couldn't be more different. I have an excellent student by the name of Jaron Davidson who's really looking at this period right now, trying to demonstrate that there are, in fact, subtle cues of continuity here, suggesting that the same basic people kept living in this region, but they made a very intentional choice to start living in a different way. And so not only did they not live in massive adobe architecture, but in many cases, they more or less completely stopped doing agriculture at all. They lived a much more mobile lifestyle, and it was certainly a much more materially mundane lifestyle, meaning they didn't care to accumulate all this exotica from all over the place. And so what I'm intention here is that you have an episode where people very clearly, and I should mention to go back here, this reference at the bottom, Phillips, I'm very much intentionally building off of their model here, that there was a foreign ideology that was essentially thrust off as people made an intentional choice to go in a very different direction. And they didn't have to look far for inspiration for where they could imagine a different sort of political organization. So now we're going to make a rapid shift here and jump all the way across the Sierra Madre Occidental and out onto the coastal plain almost into the Sonoran Desert of the Trincheras region. And now I should mention I have not done much work myself in the Trincheras region. I've done a tiny little bit on the US side of the border and that little bit that kind of skirts across into southern Arizona there. But almost everything I'm going to say here today is work that's been made possible by Randy McGuire and Alyssa Villapando, who have done an excellent job over the last several decades of really building up our knowledge of the cultural history of this region pretty much from scratch. And they've done a lot of work in two particular valleys that together fit together to tell us this kind of coherent narrative of what we think kind of occurred across the Chinchera sequence. So we begin our story over in the Altar Valley. So this is going to be slightly to the northeast of where we're eventually going to wind up, which is in the Magdalena Valley. So in the Altar Valley, we have what appears to be, for much of the time period, a relatively standard North American Southwest sequence. At this point in time, it appears these groups interact regularly with the Hohokam. There are quite clear distinctions in terms of actual manufacturing techniques. So they go about making their ceramics in a different way. They go about making their shell jewelry in a different way. But the actual forms they produce look very similar, right? So there must have been some commonalities and some at least shared desire to use the same iconic motifs to say the same sort of things about an aspirationally claimed identity. But about 1100, we start to see a real differentiation here between these two groups. And in about 1100, we start to see a site type known as Cerros de Trincheras, which themselves are a very enduring tradition across the North American Southwest. They probably serve different purposes at different times and places. But the ones that start to be built in the Altar Valley at about this time are fairly large, and they're residential, meaning people actually live on them. Some of the earlier ones were perhaps not always residential and more ritual in nature. And Randy and Alyssa make a very good case that one aspect of Cerro de Chincheras that are residential is that they're very defensive. They effectively preclude the efficacy of what we would call a run-through raid, which was the form of warfare that was witnessed in the ethnohistoric period, where people kind of run through a village and they try and do as much damage as possible. Because you have all these readouts and kind of complicated trails to move through the hill and also just have to run uphill, it's a very effective defense mechanism. So it probably says something about the nature of the way relationships are going at this time period. And then at about 1300, Randy and Alyssa perceive a more or less population replacement where Trincherano people move out of the valley and they seem to be replaced by Hohokam folks moving in. So likely some sort of hostile relationships going on here, or at least a concern that they might erupt. Now, it's important to keep in mind what's going on in the Hohokam world at this time. This is the classic period is really getting underway. This is really the kind of early classic, the late classics. This is when we really see kind of institutionalized inequality taking off in certain dimensions in the Hohokam world. Domestic structures are being built on platform mounds. Shell jewelry consumption is changing from this system where everybody kind of has the same shells as a way to kind of claim a shared identity to something that's becoming more commonly, not exclusively, but more commonly a kind of individual badge of office. And it's being used in a lot more kind of personalized aggrandizement. And my basic argument here is that we see Trincheras probably very intentionally going in the exact opposite direction with these people they had previously shared a lot of connections with. And so as this population moves in to the Magdalena Valley, there were certainly already Trincherano people here. They had already built some Cerro de Trincheras, but they come together and they build this absolutely massive monumental site known as the Cerro de Trincheras. And if you've ever heard of any site in Sonora, you've probably heard of the Cerro de Trincheras. Randy and Alyssa think that maybe perhaps as many as 1,000 people lived here. And it's really most famous for all of these Trincheras walls, which are just dry laid masonry walls that were built all across the north face of this site. And you can see that they run pretty evenly across there. And so some people have looked at this and said, well, that certainly suggests, a kind of grand architectural plan must have required some sort of leadership. At a minimum, it would have required some sort of super household organization. But what I really want to emphasize here is that you can see these things from kilometers away, and it really makes quite a communal statement about the level of internal organization that people can come together to build this kind of massive thing and modify the landscape in this way. That was probably a very effective deterrent to basically say, look, we are very capable of working together for a common goal here. And so, like those other trincheras that we just talked about, it's a multi-purpose place, right? It's a village, it's a public monument, it's a defensive bastion, it's a ritual center, it's all of the above. But what really contrasts to this massive communal effort is any sort of self-aggrandizement. So if we look at the domestic architecture, it's very minimal. It's very understated. It tends to be, we think, mostly simple hook hall structures. Not so long ago, Ben Nelson even proposed that maybe this was a vacant ceremonial center. Nobody really holds with that interpretation today. But the point was that the architecture there that's on these terraces was so minimal that it was an idea that could even be entertained. There's a lot of middens here, so we know that people were in fact living here persistently, right? But it was a very materially minimist tradition in a lot of ways. At the same time period, well, Hohokam goes in a different direction with what it's doing with its painted ceramics. Trincheras, one of the only places in the North American Southwest where a painted tradition just completely ceases. Shell jewelry manufacturers seems to kind of stay still more in that zone of being badges of broad membership as opposed to individual aggrandizement. There's certainly room for discussion there, and Randy and Alyssa have done a very good job of showing that there are some households here that probably specialize in shell production. So it's not a completely flat society by any stretch of the imagination, but it's one that generally promotes communal statements of affiliation over individualizing statements. And we can see this to some extent also in the public architecture, which is to say those features that were built to bring people together at this site. The site is shaped like a natural amphitheater. And so way down in front of the site, you have this feature known as La Concha. And Randy and Alyssa have suggested that maybe this is a dance area or some other kind of public venue. But importantly, everybody on this hill almost, because everybody lives along this north-facing amphitheater side, could probably see whatever rituals are taking place in there. So even though you can't fit 1,000 people in there, people can participate as observers, and believe it or not, they could probably even hear what's going on in there. It's a really kind of eerie phenomenon to be up near the top of this site, and you can hear like individual chickens clucking down in the village below and that sort of thing because of this natural amphitheater quality of the site. This contrasts to some extent with some architecture that's right below the summit on this kind of broad saddle area. So there's a unique feature there called the caracal. And as you can tell from the scale here, it's not huge. So definitely not a feature that everybody could get in at once. Perhaps you could fit a lot of people kind of around it on this saddle area. But Randy and Alyssa make a good case that this was probably a place that had restricted access. And again, we're going back to that observation that it's hard to move through these sites and you can really kind of control the flow of people. And not everybody was probably allowed to go up here. And so you do have an elite in a certain sense. The higher up on the hill, probably the more prestige you have. But again, it doesn't look anything like what we have at Pakime and how we would apply the label of elite there. Alyssa has made some very interesting suggestions that maybe there's actually an argument to be made that these were female-centric rituals that were conducted at the top of the Cerro de Trincheras, and maybe there are kind of other logics of seclusion going on here. This is based on the fact that they found a lot of crafts that we associate with female production here. So right below this summit area, there are a couple of terraces where we also find a whole lot of objects that could be interpreted as being broadly relevant to different forms of community ritual. So some of these are probably done more in seclusion by only a handful of people, but a couple of things like feasting and even an interpretation that maybe there's an early form of the deer dance that is practiced in this location. This is based on the fact that we have some what appear to be kind of leg rattles and also some perhaps other elements of a deer dancer costume that were found in this context. But these tend to be very public-facing rituals. So again, we have overall a story of inclusivity here. And then finally, we have only very limited data on burial context. But by chance, when they were building the great museum that's here at Trincheras, they encountered an Urnfield cemetery. which is to say a location where cremation urns were all placed together. And just the mere fact that there was a community cemetery as opposed to individuals being buried in their specific domestic terraces suggests, again, this emphasis on kind of a communal nature. And the original excavators of this, Jim Watson and Jessica Cereza-Roman, have really emphasized that seems to be something that's very prevalent in the burial practices here, that you have this kind of erasure of individual identity as you become a common pool ancestor. And there are some, interesting elite objects here, perhaps, or at least I shouldn't call them elite objects, but rare objects, a couple of copper bells, a couple of Casas Grandes ceramics. In general, any sort of foreign ceramic is extremely rare to cite. I believe the proportion is something like 0.14%. In other words, 0.0014 proportion is any sort of foreign ceramic, and none, curiously enough, from the Hohokam region. But it looks like when these things are brought into society, they are kind of held on for one generation and then they're kind of destroyed or at least taken out of circulation as they enter this urnfield cemetery. So it's not a place that looks like it's interested in multi-general accumulation. So what happens at the end of Trincheras? There is certainly a very murky transition to the historic period in which this region is completely dominated by various Atum groups. Soba Atum, Hiyashera Atum, what was proto-historically referred to as the Upper Pima, but certainly closely related to Tohono O'odham and other groups. My own interpretation is that once Hohokam kind of goes through its own perturbations and really kind of dissolves as what archaeologists think of as Hohokam, that platform mound system that was very kind of opposed to what Trincheras was goes away, and folks probably feel less of a need to live in a completely kind of opposed political manner. And so things go back to a largely egalitarian but more dispersed sort of living. But again, these enduring traditions of egalitarianism largely continue. So lastly now, we're going to jump over to the region where I have worked the longest, which is the Sierra Madre Occidental. And I should really, again, thank Steve Lexon in this case for giving me such a kind of polemical statement to kick this section off. So I'll just read it to you here. Sonora was perhaps the most densely settled area in the greater Southwest, yet its archaeology is singly uninspiring. Now, I should be fair here and say something about the broader context in which Steve was making this argument. So Steve, again, was really kind of trying to trace the political dynasties of things he saw at Lake Chaco Canyon to Paquimé, and Paquimé, which ends, as I've said, in a fairly punctuated way at around 1400 to 1450, curiously contemporaneously with Cerro de Trincheras. Steve was really curious, well, where did these people go next, right? Where does this dynasty kind of continue on? And one idea he kind of toyed with, as have many others, was that maybe after Casas Grandes kind of deteriorated in their telling of the story, some of that population went over to Sierra Madre Occidental to what we refer today as the Rio Sonora region or the Serrana region. And a lot of this is based on the ethnohistoric observations. The first Spanish who came into the region in the 1500s, they noted two really dense population centers. One of them was in this region of the Sierra Madre Occidental, and the other was along the Rio Grande, right? So Steve is very much acknowledging that we think there were a whole lot of people here in this region at this time. But he's absolutely right in the sense that the archaeological material culture doesn't look anything like the hordes of eccentricities and exotic objects that you get at Paquimé or some of the other very elaborate things you got at places like Chaco Canyon, 4 or 5 generations previous to that. It is, in the grand scheme of things, mundane in a certain sense. But what is perhaps uninspiring in a materialist sense, I think, could be interpreted to be quite inspiring in a political logic sense. So just to give a bit of background here, it's really important to understand a lot of these ethnohistoric accounts, they didn't really go outside of the valleys that these early explorer folks were moving up, right? And so they give a very kind of biased view of the landscape. There were, in fact, probably many, many, many people here, and they were, in fact, very densely packed into certain locations. And those locations, as described by those early Spanish folks, seem to be very productive. Almost everybody who goes through here in the 1500s and even early 1600s describes practices of double and triple cropping. But it's important to note that can only be done in the relatively narrow floodplains of these rivers. And so here I am standing on the eastern uplands of the Rio Bavispe looking west, and that dark green strip there is basically the only place where you could do something like irrigation or floodwater restoration agriculture. And you can kind of take your chances at doing just direct rainfall agriculture outside of that, but that was risky today, and it would certainly be risky many years ago. But there's another caveat we also need to add about agriculture even within these narrow strips, which is that flooding can be a real issue. Um, Bill Doolittle has done an incredible amount of work on this, and he points out in early, in intellectual terms, not that this hasn't been done for hundreds and hundreds of years, but in early a set of observations about traditional ecological knowledge, right? That people have developed some really interesting ways to basically manage sediment down on these floodplains. And they do these things called living fence rows, where they plant these rows of trees to basically trap sediment. But what Bill has very effectively shown by doing kind of longitudinal studies is this is basically a zero-sum game, right? So if you kind of reclaim a bit of floodplain in one spot, you're almost definitely going to be kind of claiming it from someplace else and turning somebody else's land into a worthless gravel bar. So this is important in kind of the grand scheme of how we understand subsistence production, because it means any one family probably couldn't, for many generations, control the best land, even if they were handing it down one to the other, right? Because there's this kind of randomizing effect that the best land in one generation quite likely might be a gravel bar in the next generation. So that kind of sets up some basic ecological parameters. So here's just some examples of the settlement patterns of the region. And again, trying to make this point that the vast majority of people seem to really be constrained to these narrow river valleys. Now, I should be honest here, we haven't really thoroughly surveyed many uplands, but to the extent we have looked, it matches pretty much our expectations that it doesn't look like many people are living up there. Certainly was an area of important resource extraction, but everybody's more or less crammed into these river valleys. And so that means you have kind of vast spaces without a lot of people in them, and then a lot of people along the river valley, and it's not necessarily super visible at the scale I have these maps. But if we take the Rio Moctezuma here, for instance, I should mention this is kind of artificially cut off. It's not that settlements end here to the south. They would have kept going. I just didn't survey any farther there. But we can see there's also these narrow canyon sections that more or less partition groups, even along these river valleys. And the places we've looked closely, you can make a pretty good argument that these are autonomous communities, even along an individual river valley. And this is supported by ethnohistoric observation, with the early Jesuits frequently complaining about how as soon as they made friends in one valley, that almost instantly made them the automatic enemies of the people in the next river valley, because a lot of these groups, as I'll describe here in a moment, didn't necessarily get along with each other. So one of these locations I want to point out is the only one here that I didn't actually do the survey for. It was surveyed back in the 1970s by Bill Doolittle. Is the Sonora Valley. By an order of magnitude, it is the largest contiguous arable parcel on this landscape. And so it's got some kind of special attributes that don't seem to be common across the rest of the region. And I should also point out here, some of these are slightly different scales, so that can be confusing. So in terms of the material culture, it's really defined by variation as opposed to a lot of shared themes. There are certainly some undercurrents that are common basic building techniques. If we look at the architecture, the domestic architecture that is, the most common form are what we refer to as cimiento alignments. These are river cobbles that anchor what were perishable superstructures, probably simple wattle and daub structures. You will find instances in which these are put together into contiguous room blocks, but they tend to be pretty small, 5, 6, and probably a predominance of independent freestanding structures, right? So not even a lot of evidence for large-scale integration at these very kind of small levels of integration. There are some places where you get more adobe, and I found one instance of something that looked like masonry, but by and large, it's pretty simple structures. Stuck here. There we go. The ceramic assemblages, they tend to be highly variable from river valley to river valley. There's not much in the way of trade wares. There's essentially nothing from Mesoamerica. You get some Casas Grandes ceramics, and I think I have a slide coming up here where I show that you have some appreciable amounts of Casas Grandes ceramics coming in here in the far north and along the kind of far eastern edge here. But in the vast majority of valleys, it's pretty much the local tradition and nothing else. You get like 0.1% or 0.001 proportion. But interestingly, each one of these valleys seems to have its own preferred kind of texturing technique. And they often also have either no texturing, and they alternatively develop a painted tradition, but these painted traditions tend to be quite unique from valley to valley. And they tend to be more or less simple red on brown traditions, but nonetheless distinct from valley to valley. And strangely enough, we don't really get any of those sorts of symbols that we think of being kind of pan-Southwestern in character. This region apparently didn't have a whole lot of interest in those. And there's never anything that takes hold across this entire region that we could think of as being equivalent to something like the Salado tradition, where we associate it with a particular kind of religious movement. These are regions that had presumably a very high amount of autonomy, and that's reflected even in the kind of day-to-day material culture, right? That these traditions were quite distinct from valley to valley. At higher scales of integration, again, we really have to stretch to see anything that we might associate with being evidence that there was some sort of leadership position where people were able to organize a lot of labor to basically build a material edifice that said, like, yes, we are a community with a recognized shared identity that expands across a significant geographic space. The Rio Sonora Valley, as I mentioned, is unique in terms of its contiguous arable size. And this is the one place where maybe you get some exceptions to this. There have been a couple of features that are kind of similar to La Concha in terms of their overall size, as I was describing for the Cerro de Trincheras, periodically interpreted as ball courts, certainly some kind of like public venue of some sort. A couple other places where maybe if you really squint, you could identify something that we would call a plaza, but it would take a real stretch of the imagination to call this a public architecture in any kind of traditional sense. And I'll just mention here, I should have mentioned this a few slides ago, my color coding system, any place you see these kind of boundaries around these images, it's represented over here on the map where exactly those examples come from. So this purple one, as you can see, is over here in the Moctezuma Valley, and these blue ones here in the Rio Sonora Valley. So again, here are just those unique features in the Sonora Valley, but this is kind of much more typical of the region. You know, maybe if you squint, you can call this a platform mound, but it's really tiny. It's about 5 by 7 meters. It's the kind of thing that an individual household could build, and we're not even actually sure it was a platform mound. But there are these curious ethnohistoric references to leaders getting up in the morning and going to what were referred to as small heights that basically give directions to people in the morning, and then curiously, basically everybody ignoring them and going about exactly what they're doing anyways. There are a few locations where we get kind of Cerro de Trincheras traditions coming in. So again, if you infer any kind of pattern here, it's diversity, right? You get a kind of hodgepodge of different traditions seemingly tried out, but no of them really stick, and none of them are really grandiose in terms of scale of the labor required to construct them. But curiously enough, this is the one region that doesn't seem to undergo major demographic flux in the period from about, broadly speaking, 1100 all the way up to 1600, and I would say probably even beyond in this particular region. So I've already noted both Trincheras and the Casas Grandes region exhibiting, probably for very different reasons and in different kind of historical contexts, pretty drastic swings in demography. We could tell the same story with the classic groups up in the North American Southwest. Certainly the Hohokam experience a more or less simultaneous perturbation where they go through some sort of major reorganization event. Sometimes it's classified as kind of an internal thing. Sometimes it's classified as coming from the external. I think internal is much more likely. But whatever the case, they also undergo some major demographic swings at around 1400. In the Pueblo region, the timing's a bit different. But again, if you know anything about the history of Mesa Verde, where Crow Canyon is, next door to, there are some pretty big migration events and demographic fluxes. Now, our dating is absolutely horrible in this region. We don't have very many dates, but if we stack them all together and sum them all up and use the basic logic that, as people live in a place, they make trash, and then archaeologists, they come later and they kind of more or less randomly sample that trash and they randomly date things. You can kind of add all those radiocarbon dates together and they give you a basic idea of what was the overall demographic trajectory. And so what we see here, where I've done this, any one valley, we don't really have enough dates to make this useful, and they kind of qualitatively show you there were people there across a long period of time. But when we stack them all up here, what we basically see is a spike at 1000 AD. And I think there were people here beforehand, but this is just when they move on to the mesas where they're archaeologically visible. And then you get more or less a plateau. You can ignore these spikes here as just being a weird mathematical quirk of the radiocarbon curve. And then there's a bit of what appears to be a drop off at around 1550 here, but that's really just more a reflection of the fact that we don't date things with radiocarbon past that point, because the radiocarbon curve gets really bad and we get other means of doing things. And we can also see this qualitatively. Basically, any place that we've been able to identify in early mission context, you go immediately across the closest arroyo, and you find a settlement that looks like it was occupied at least since 1000 AD, usually with clear evidence that it was occupied right up until the 1400s, the 1450s, and then the Spanish come in and they basically convinced those same people to move across the arroyo and live in that new place instead right next to the mission, right? So overall, what we have here is an extremely stable, at the region scale, story of demographic continuity. I imagine there are probably smaller scale swings we're just not perceiving here. So how do we understand all of this? I'm going to go ahead and skip this slide just to make sure I leave some time for questions. But the cast this in a larger light, going back to these ethnohistoric records of what we think we know about leadership in this region, certainly the archaeology doesn't support that there were any sort of kind of systemized or institutionalized leadership. But these ethnohistoric contexts, um, they've often been used to imply by previous researchers that trade and exchange was really important in this region. And this is based on a geographical logic that they have these nice north-south river valleys. It's conveniently located between the North American Southwest and Mesoamerica. Certainly there must have been turquoise flowing one way and other things flowing the other way, right? The corridors of interaction. So a couple years ago, I got interested in seeing what these documents really said. And so I went through and I systematically coded every time a whole bunch of different words or different sorts of things were described. This is the kind of thing you could probably have an AI do for you in 5 minutes. It took me several months, but I counted up all the times references were made to what anthropologists would classically consider prime movers, which are basically different venues in which elites leverage things to become elites, right? And you certainly get a lot of things that are referenced in what I call the exchange category here, but what really stood out was the frequency of warfare references. And there are a lot of kind of curious observations made by the Spanish. The Spanish were not a kind group of people at this time. They basically battled their way through this region in a very callous manner, but that did cause them to make some interesting observations. And they're constantly kind of struggling with the logic that clearly the indigenous population does not have the same concept of warfare that they do. Right? That it seems to be a much more kind of prestige-based, individualized, aggrandizing event as opposed to really a kind of strategic objectives. And so they talk about like, oh, they had us cornered and they could have killed us all, but then they just kind of didn't, right? It was clearly not something that was intended or designed to be a high lethality kind of event. Or to describe scenarios where, we were totally losing, but then we killed this one random person, and then they just all seemed to stop and go home because that was the war leader, and apparently it was only kind of him who had organized this thing. Or another instance in which they were talking about how there was a confederation that came together and they would have totally defeated the Spanish, except for the fact that they couldn't stop fighting amongst themselves, right? And so all these kind of different vignettes go together to kind of read between the lines to suggest that this was a very competitive venue in which people kind of sought prestige, but one that was also kind of very unstable and not really an avenue to entrenched inequality or institutionalized heritable inequality. And there's just one last example here. I'll mention the story of Sisu Butari. So this was an individual described by Pailes de Ribes around the Sarawipa Valley in the mid-early 1600s. And he was very excited to meet this individual because he was very open to the idea of missionization, and he seemed to control a lot of towns and villages to the immediate north where they wanted to move next. And then in Pailes de Ribes's view, very unfortunately, Sisu Butari dies, and we're not really told why. But he's very distraught by this because he recognizes there's no kind of continuity in who the next leader is, right? These villages are not going to continue to operate in the same way. It appeared that there was this one charismatic leader, and once he was gone, everything that was agreed to previously completely evaporated. And it basically sets the mission program back by a generation in Pailes de Ribes's telling of events here. So to kind of bring it back to the big themes here, I have kind of my pithy summaries of the three regions we've covered here. Where Pakime, I think of it as an impressively complex place, but one that ultimately met with violence, probably because the ideology was fundamentally built on a house of sand, right? That it was this kind of foreign imposed set of ideas. And once things were not working well, people very easily defaulted back to the much more enduring traditions of not liking institutionalized leadership. And they probably, at least to some extent, let the leaders know that in a way that involves some degree of violence before they completely went a different direction and tried to erase kind of any vestige of what Pakime was in their new lifestyle. Cerro de Trincheras, an experiment in egalitarianism, at least as I present it, but one that in large part was driven by the fact that they wanted to be very opposed. People throw around this idea of shishmogenesis, right? This idea that you want to kind of define yourself in opposition to exterior groups. And this is perhaps a great example of that, right? They saw the path that their presumably close relatives of Hohokam were taking, and they decided to go in a completely different direction, probably in part because of pre-existing animosities, but probably also just because of different political philosophies to begin with. And then finally, the Sierra Madre Occidental, a region that's kind of defined by diversity, but also along with it, defined by kind of super local autonomy, where institutionalized leadership was never really able to put down roots. And if we think about the grand narrative of the North American Southwest and we kind of recenter things, we recognize the Rio Sonora region is actually, geographically speaking, quite central and certainly could have served as a repository for a lot of these different traditions, even while groups around at different points of time experimented with less egalitarian ways, that in fact these enduring traditions always seem to kind of come back, and probably in a quite intentional way because they were drawing from this kind of shared memory of experience that often persisted in neighboring groups. Okay, so I will end it there with an entire 4 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Matthew. We've got some questions here that we can get us started. A really kind of broad one is, so we were talking about all of these, what's going on in Northwest, what is today Mexico. And we had some people curious about connections to the northern U.S., Southwest, some broader connections. Is there anything you'd like to comment on about that?
Yeah, I mainly I would point people to the folks who have done a lot better work in that sphere than I have. So Steve Lexon certainly makes a very interesting case, and Steve LeBlanc has got some stuff coming out as well that really kind of ties Paquimé to Chaco Canyon and really sees this as the continuation of a singular kind of elite dynasty, right? It's the same family, or at least the same kind of group of families who kind of carry this tradition on, and you can certainly see that marked in particular material attributes. So things like T-shaped doorways, depictions of what appear to be elites that have kind of, if not tattoos, some sort of, decorative treatment on their chins that maybe mark certain individuals. So things that are kind of specific enough that they're certainly not random, whether it's, the same exact families kind of moving from place to place, it's certainly the same traditions that are remembered and kind of recapitulated over and over in this kind of like cycle of the rise and fall, or the boom of bust, so to speak, of these kind of elite lineages. Over in the Hohokam region, I kind of spoke to some extent about the fact that you see this kind of strange parallel between Hohokam and Trincheras up until about 1100. That's a really interesting one. And again, Randy and Alyssa would have much more intelligent things to say about this than I do. But you have this kind of aspirational claim that's made with kind of shared motifs, but
Mm,
these manufacturing techniques that are really quite different to suggest kind of different communities of practice and different kind of
mm,
groups that you actually learn from.
right,
Randy's student Hunter Claypatch also has some really interesting things to say about this, really from the perspective of ceramics.
right.
With Rio Sonora, I mean, there's kind of broad shared similarities, but honestly, I don't see a lot of direct ties. I will mention there is a site that my colleagues at Ina Sonora are excavating right now in the way, way, way kind of headwaters of the Magdalena, not even really depicted here, that would kind of get you right over to the kind of top of Rio Sonora. And it's a site that clearly has stuff from kind of all over the place. It's got Rio Sonora, it's got a bit of Casas Grandes, it's got Mogollon, it's got Hohokam. So there are these few places on the landscape where you do have these really kind of nodes where it all comes together. But hopefully there'll be an interesting publication to come out about that.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, we got a pretty specific question, and I think this is in reference to Cerro de Trincheras, but some of the kind of copper bells that you showed there from there, is there any specific research that's been done on the origin of that copper?
No. So, I mean, some years ago, people got into the idea of trying to um, use isotopic methods to source copper, and this was kind of done broadly in Mesoamerica. Um, People have kind of started to toy around with doing this, and so I think it would be possible, but the work has not been done yet. So Ali Thibodeau, for instance, has done things with turquoise, which has got
Mhm.
copper in it, but
Right,
she's not actually looking at copper isotopes.
right.
But rare lead isotopes, rare strontium isotopes, things that are not kind of principal components of these mineral lattices, but nonetheless exist in there. And so she's done some interesting studies on things like the copper crossbow bolts that people like Coronado use, right? So I think it would be possible, but no, nobody's done it yet.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That answers that question very well. Okay, so I have kind of a selfish question. Um, So when you do this kind of survey across this parallel, as you described it, is there anything interesting that you notice about kind of how food is being used, kind of food ways just in general, and the different kind of political organizations that you're kind of summing up here? Anything that
Y-
you noticed?
Yeah, I mean, the subsistence is something that I probably think about too much to answer that in any sort of concise framework, right? I'm going to want to go down too many rabbit holes. I'll mention all three of these are societies that are probably principally reliant on irrigation of a certain sort, right? Something I didn't probably emphasize quite enough is, even though these Rio Sonora communities are extremely productive, even
Mhm.
historically, the largest canal you get there is 11 kilometers long, and that's in that Sonora Valley. They just don't need to be very big. You can kind of do
Big.
laterals straight off uh, the main river channel there. Over in Paquimé, they probably had pretty extensive systems. Over in Trincheras, they probably had pretty extensive systems. But we honestly don't know near as much as we should about them because typically Mexican law does not let you excavate with heavy machinery, right? And so if you
Mm.
really want to understand anything about canal irrigation, you really have to go out there and like strip huge areas and use backhoes. And that's starting to change when it's a kind of contract, or in America we would think, or the United States, I should say, a contract-oriented research. But
Yeah.
for these projects that have all been kind of academic, you're still not going to be allowed to take a backhoe out there and find all the canals. And so a lot of that, it's a bit conjectural, but certainly
Mm.
there are parallels in terms of the logics of the systems and the basic methods used.
Sure. I just get really interested in kind of how we, especially now today, how we think about feasting and I saw that you had coded that out in your summaries of those historical documents, and so just evidence for that or things like that. So
Yeah, so a lot of evidence of that at Paquimé. You get huge, huge agave roasting pits, and some
right.
of those so-called chief fields in that article by Minnis, are thought to be production facilities for those. And then, the agave hearts are taken to Paquimé, and you just have these, huge venues in which they're doing that. And
Yeah.
even making the fire for those feasting events is probably an
Yeah.
exceptional event. The basalt stones they use are actually vitrified, right? So they're probably kind of putting on a bit of a pyrotechno display,
Yeah.
even just to make the coals to kind of like roast the agave.
Yeah.
And so certainly there's some kind of performative aspects to this.
Gotcha.
I mentioned in Trincheras, with the deer elements, there's been some interpretations of feasting. It's been in general kind of less excavation there, so it's a little harder to pin down. And then yeah,
Sure.
I've got the ethnohistoric evidence there in uh, uh, the Rio Sonora region.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay, here's another one. So, does it look like there is more likely to be a population that got fed up or too high of like an economic drain on limited resources? Is there a narrative or other evidence to support a reasoning for any particular one or the other here? That's this question.
Yeah, so I mean, I would assume it's something like that was a triggering event in Paquimé. The trick
Yeah,
with Northwest Mexico relative to the North American, the Southwest on the US side is we don't have very good environmental records. And to some extent, that requires us to be a bit more creative and not just kind of throw everything off on environmental determinism. But obviously, that data would be very useful, right? So
yeah,
you can certainly tell a likely scenario is this is the Chihuahuan Desert. You're going to get periods which are a bit harder to do agriculture in. You get these
right.
larger El Nino and oscillations out in the Caribbean as well that kind of create these decadal cycles. So it's quite possibly that maybe it was just a bad decade. And pretty quickly, these folks whose entire kind of basis for being elites was, rooted in ideas of we guarantee fertility of both the people and the crops. And if that looked unrealistic for a bit of time, that people might have said like, maybe we're not going to like give you all of our food anymore. Um,
Hmm.
but in terms of direct evidence to show that actually what happened, we just don't have that data. There's a good student at Arizona right now, Dakota Larrick, who's working hard at the true ring sequence to maybe get at some of this in the near future.
Oh, that's really interesting. Oh, I've got questions about that, but I'll leave them. I think we're going to make this one our last question. I should note that everyone that's asked questions has said thank you so much for the presentation and how fantastic it was. But we'll make this one the last one. So this one said, thank you for the presentation, Matt. Do you think that perhaps the more challenging landscape that the Sierra Madre influenced the political organization of the Rio Sonora region? Compared, for example, to the wider Salt River Valley, where you see Hohokam platform mounds.
Yeah, well, I really see this kind of interesting in the story in terms of just what sort of integration was possible, right? And so, like I mentioned, that the largest canal you get there, even in the 1970s, was 11 kilometers. You get canals that are pretty common up in the Hohokam region that are 20 some odd kilometers, right? And there were dozens of them. And so you're kind of capable of just integrating larger areas and probably larger numbers of people just because you don't have the same ecological constraints, which is what I think that question is getting at there. So again, I am not sure of how much of this to kind of root in a sort of kind of de facto environmental determinism mediated through topography, and how much of it is, no, we understand things. We looked at HOCOM and we didn't want to do that because we thought that was a bad idea, and we didn't want to be that integrated, and we didn't want to let those platform mount elites come around because we saw where that was going.
Sure.
Um, I kind of tell the story the way I think it gives more agency to the indigenous people of the region, but that's not to say these other factors were not very important.
Sure. Absolutely understand. All right, so we've got people in the chat here that are saying thank you so much for the presentation and thank you so much, Matt. We really appreciate it
Well, of
and
course,
for
happy to do
joining
it.
us. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we're going to end it here. We've got another presentation on Thursday, and then the Thursday after that is our annual meeting. So join us for that. All right, we're going to end it. Thanks.
Thank
Bye, everyone.
you.